Hello everyone, welcome to Zobrio University's webinar on customizing columns and financial statements. Today we have Kathy Dwyer, a Senior Application Consultant here at Zobrio, to lead the webinar. If you have any questions, please leave them in the chat, which is located at the bottom of your screen, and we will go over all questions at the end. Thank you, and I will now hand it back over to Kathy.
Okay, thank you, Colleen. As Colleen mentioned, we'll be talking about custom column creation in your MIP fund accounting reports. And just we'll talk in general, and then what I'm going to do is show you some samples in the various reports. Okay. Well, first of all, let me, and to be honest with you, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and use the revenue and expense report as my sample. So I'm going to bring us down here under financial statements and go into the statement of revenue and expenditures. And what I have is a couple of predefined reports set up to illustrate what we'll be talking about. Okay. Well, first of all, what exactly is a custom column? Well, it's the ability for you to go to a report, and on the Content tab on the lower left-hand side of the screen, you have some predefined fields that you can select from and simply move them from the left to the right to add them to your report. Well, what happens occasionally is you might run a report and say, it's close, but maybe if I could have X, this report would suit my needs a lot better. Okay, and for example, let me just bring this report up on the screen so we can take a look at it. And okay, this is just a basic revenue and expense statement, and the way I have our financial statement formatted, it's basically just bringing up expense accounts. But what we're going to focus on is these four columns that you see, basically original budget across to the total budget remaining. Those are standard fields that we can select from when we customize the report. Well, this is going to be a real basic example. Is what if I look at this report and say, you know what, I like this percent column out on the end, but you know what, maybe I'm somebody that prefers to see not a percent remaining, but how about a percent expended? Is that something I can do? And again, I recognize this is a simple concept, but just as an introduction to the functionality. So let me go ahead here and hit the exit and bring us back here. We're on the Content tab. Well, the way you access a custom column is looking at the icon row at the top. The second one from the right is the custom column creation. And just a general rule about this is if you're setting up a brand new report, you have to save that report before this icon has focus or before you can select it. So that's just, if you look at it and you see that FX icon is there, but you can't click on it, the trick is save the report, open it back up, and then this will have focus. Okay. Now, when I go ahead and click on this, okay, what it does is it opens up a dialog window that basically says, okay, you want to create a custom column. Tell me a little bit about it. In other words, give me a name. And again, I'm going to, in the interest of time, I'm going to select one that's already been created. And I basically just called it PERC, short for percent. I want the column heading to say percent expend EXP. And really, once we get those basics set up, the program wants to know, well, is this based on this custom column? Is it based on some type of formula, mathematical formula? Or is it based on maybe the data in the column is based or date dependent? Okay. Now, this one, I'm going to just introduce us to a formula. And by selecting the radio button for formula, then what I do is I go up to the tab that says Formula Editor. And this is a start of a fairly basic in the sense that on the left-hand side of the screen, you're going to see basically all the different numeric fields, dollar fields that are available on this report. And what you can do in the left-hand column is basically select a field and using the arrow pointing to the right, you move it over onto the right. And what that does is allows you to start developing a formula where you can see here on the right-hand side, I've basically said I'm creating a column that says take my current year actual and divide it by my year-to-date budget original. Okay, and those basically your mathematical operands are in the upper right there, where you can see a plus, a minus, a divide, a multiply, and then the parens are there if you have a more sophisticated formula that requires maybe add these two numbers together or these two variables, like you might say take my encumbrances plus actual and divide it by the budget. Then you introduce the parameters or the parens to make the mathematical formula work. Okay, but in this instance, it's basically I've selected a variable, moved it to the right, added the operands, and on the lower part of the screen, because this is a percent column, what I want it to do is report out with 4 decimal points and produce the result as a percentage. Okay, so this is a pretty basic formula in the sense I've created that field, and I'm going to go ahead and close. Okay, when I close, it brings me back to the Content tab, and what ends up happening is if I, on the lower left, scroll to the bottom, what the program will do is add that new available column, and it's the name that we applied to, in this case, formula. I can then select that particular column, or I like to call them data fields, move it to the right, okay? And also notice on the right-hand side, you can also sometimes, to be honest with you, I find that you need to come back in and put in the column heading exactly the way you want to see it. But now, let me go ahead and do that. Let's display that report back up to the screen. And what it's done now, basically, is we have our same generic report or standard columns that we selected, but it's now added this percent expended column out onto the end of the report, and that becomes our custom column. Okay, whether you want to have both percentages column is strictly up to you. It's really just a matter of coming back like all standard reports and saying, take that away, leave my custom column. And again, if I run the report, we basically have now customized, and again, simple example, but it basically allows me to put out a column, a mathematical numeric column of data that I want to see. Now, just a note about these columns, these custom columns. You'll notice that they are available to select in the column contents, the lower half of the screen. They are not anything that you can use as for page breaks. Even if I remove the percent and move it back to the left, it's still not available in the page break. So it's really strictly a custom column. It can't be used for page breaks. It can't be used for filters. It's simply a column that you put out on the report. Okay. And again, really the biggest thing I can tell you about that is make sure if that FX icon does not have focus, save your report, come back in, and then you'll be able to use that icon. Okay. The other somewhat setup-y type information to know about a custom column is certainly you have security rights to the system. And what happens is if you're a user that has the rights to process reports, that's great, because that's what we need. We need the ability to process in order, that particular right in order to have the ability to add a custom column. Okay. Now, let me talk a little bit more about some more of the more sophisticated type things that you can do with these reports. Okay. And again, you'll see here in the demo, I'm more or less picking on this category because of financial statements and statement and revenue and expenditures. Not all reports have the custom column creation. Okay, let me just go ahead and pick a second report. Not all of them have this FX icon. Probably the top 6 that I can tell you is things like your posted general ledger reports. Of course, what we're looking at here, the statement of revenue and expenditures. There's also a statement of revenue and expenditures by period, the summary budget comparison report, the encumbrance budget report, and your purchase order register. Those are examples of reports that have this functionality. Now, of course, if you don't, a client that does not have the encumbrance module, obviously the encumbrance budget wouldn't be effective for you or available for you. But I found probably most predominantly people use this custom column creation in the statement of revenue and expenditure section of the report, of the menu. Okay. Now, let's come back here. Again, what I've done is selected just a different revenue and expense statement. And basically what I want to do is come over to the Content tab. And again, what's happened here is I'll point out that these 3 columns that I'm highlighting on the lower right, July, August, and September, these are custom columns that I've pre-created on the report. Okay. And let me just go ahead and run this, because sometimes it's better to run the report and then look back at how did we get those results. Okay. So what we've done is this, again, is just, this is going to demonstrate the example of using not just a formula-based column, but a date override column. And what's happening here is, yes, I've pulled in our original budget. And then rather than getting just my current year-to-date expenditure, what I've basically told the system is break out my expenses by individual months. So give me a total by July, total for August, total for September, and then what ends up happening is it gives us a running total. This current period actual is a running total of all 3, because you'll notice in the header of my report, the date range that I've selected is just basically, in these files, it's a July 1st to June 30th fiscal year. So I'm looking for basically the first quarter of the fiscal year. Okay. So let me show you how we went about creating these 3 custom columns. Okay, I'm going to exit out and come back down to our Content tab. Okay. I'm going to come up here to the custom column icon. And again, I pre-created some of these entries, but basically what it is because I wanted a specific month, I called it July. Rather than selecting the formula button, I've selected the date override. When I select the date override radio button, I go up to the date override tab. And in here, what ends up happening is there's more or less 3 sections here, okay? The first thing the program wants to know is, well, what do you want to put in that column? Do you want to see actual transactions? Do you want to see budgetary? Or do you want to see encumbrances? Okay. In our example, we're going to grab actual, and then it does force you to answer the detail column. And more or less, that's because if you're selecting budget, it wants to know which budget version you're looking for. But if you're a user that uses the color coding to indicate required fields, it will prompt you to answer both of those questions. Okay. Now, once we've determined the type of data that we're putting in this column, the next thing is on the left side of the screen. I've basically demonstrating, in this case, fixed dates, okay, because there's something called a fixed date or something called a rolling date. This example is going to focus on the fixed dates, where I very specifically tell the system, I want you to pull actual transactions for the time period of July 1st through July 31st. Okay. Likewise, if I come back up to custom column creation and I tell it that I want the computer to move, I seem to be frozen. Let me save that and come back in. And that's because I was changing some fields. The system wanted me to make a save. Okay, but here, likewise with August, what happens is this is a date override column. We're likewise putting actual data in there. We're using a fixed date. So we've got, as you can see, the August date ranges. Okay. Likewise, if I want to create, say, September, it's also a date override. Our tab indicates actual data, and we've, again, indicated fixed dates. Okay. And it's pretty handy when you do something like that for your current, say, calendar or fiscal year. When your fiscal year, say, crosses over in increments by one, the one thing bad about fixed dates is you got to go back in and get these custom columns and basically increment the year on each one of your fields. So it's one of those things. It's good for the 12 months within your fiscal year. If you want the same report for the following fiscal year, you might find it's best to copy that report. And when you copy a report, what you'll find is these custom columns come forward on a copy. If you were to create one from scratch, then you have to create the custom columns from scratch. Okay, so again, this is an example of, I don't have any formulas here, but more or less a fixed date custom columns. Okay. Now, let's do this. Let me close out of this report and bring up, okay, get that to roll out of the way. Let's come back to reports, financial statements. I'm going to come back to the statement of revenue expenditures. This time, what I'm going to do is I'm going to skip down to my third example here. And basically, again, we're looking at more or less the same foundation or same type of report. But what's happening here is I'm going to demonstrate not just custom column fixed dates. In this example, I'm going to basically use the dates, but rolling dates. Okay. So what does that mean? Well, basically, first of all, let me tell you, these 5 columns on the bottom are custom columns that are predefined. Okay, and what the rolling dates are going to allow us to do is basically do comparative reports. Like we could create a report that shows, hey, show me the budget for the current year, show me the budget for the prior year, show me the budget for the prior year. We could say, let's do a comparative column for the current month this year to the same month of the prior year. We could say take the quarter, this year's quarter, or even month, and compare it to the prior year month or the prior year quarter. So fixed dates, that's kind of speak for themselves. It's going to pull exactly what you tell it to. The rolling dates, and let's bring up the custom column screen and look at that, is I'm going to bring up this prior year budget column that I've called the PY budget. It is a date override, but you'll notice the radio button for rolling dates is highlighted. And what I'm going to do is when you're comparing year-to-date data, what you do is you select this first option that says current reporting year begins. And what that's referring to is when we, and let me close that for just a second. When we look at these different reports, your setup tab has different dates on it. Okay, and this is what it's referring to over here on the lower left is the current reporting year begins. So when you talk in terms of what's a rolling date, it's basically when you're looking to do something on an annual or yearly basis, it's going to point back to that date we just saw on your setup tab. Okay. So same thing here is upper screen. I neglected to say this column we're identifying we want to put budget information and that we want, I'm going to say our original budget. Okay. The dates are basically rolling dates, meaning, again, take my instance, I had the current fiscal year begin date, but I'm telling it to roll back 1 year. So by rolling that back 1 year and using the current reporting date as my baseline, this is how it knows to go get my prior year. Now, likewise, let me go ahead and save that. Likewise, if I do something here with my abbreviations are pretty succinct, but I want to see, and you know what, let me do the same thing here. Let me get PY1. This is basically show me my prior year actuals, okay? And how do I get that on this report? Well, again, it's a date override, okay? And in this case, because it's not, I'm looking for basically actual information, I want to have it pulled by quarter, and my options could have been by month, quarter, year, or year to date. My example, I wanted to do quarter just so that I could show you in this instance, if it's something other than year, you choose the opening balances relative to option, and it's the same concept as you're rolling back the number of quarters. And what's nice about this is on your lower right side of the screen, you know, if you're like, oh, do I put in a 1? Do I put in a 2? What do I put in there? Let me just put in a 3 to show you what will happen. Is the system will give you basically a visual of what rolling it back by X number of quarters, what that represents. So if you're in doubt of how many quarters or how many months to roll back, enter a value. The system will display to you what it wants, what it assumes is rolling back 4 quarters based on your dates on the setup tab. And it basically, as we can see, in this instance, I'm looking for the first quarter of, in this case, it's July through September. Let me go ahead and save that. And again, let's run that to put that a little bit to words. Okay, is prior year budget, and what I've opted to do, and I neglected to say, is there is a checkoff box in the custom column creation that says, do you want to include the date range in the column heading? So here, the second column, the prior year budget, is showing us the date range. I have current year 1, which basically shows me expenditures for my current year. Prior year 1, and again, the date range reflects what we've created that custom column to extract. So it's, maybe this is a bit of a confusing report, but it's basically, I wanted to illustrate the fact that you could pull annual comparison data. It could be on a budgetary basis, or you could do actual data and do comparative, whether it be, again, monthly, quarterly, or yearly. So it's basically a really powerful feature that you can use in this reporting. I did want to mention one other thing here, because it's something that I get asked occasionally, is there are, on the revenue and expense reports, under the options tab, there is this option to include encumbrances on the report, but what it does is it combines it in or adds it to the expenditure column. Okay. One of the really neat things that can happen here with a report, with a custom column creation, is our current year actual right now is just that. It's expenses plus encumbrances. Well, what if I was a user that wanted to break that out? I want to see actual in one column and encumbrances in another. Can I do that? Well, the answer is basically yes. And what happens is again, I have a combination of fields here. Let me grab this one. And again, these are just custom columns that were set up. And basically what ends up happening, and let me just put that up here, is when I go ahead and run this type of report, okay, is rather than seeing one column that combines encumbrances plus actuals, there's through the use of this custom column creation, you can break those out into their own columns. You can basically, this variance out at the end is really, in this instance, the original budget minus the encumbrances minus the actuals. Okay, but it's different things like this become possible with the reports. You can even, I'm going to take it even one step farther and add a couple of other custom columns here and run the report. So what ends up happening here is and I didn't do a good job putting in column titles, but what ends up happening is of these 2% expenditure columns, basically what happens is my first expenditure column is factoring in just the original budget less the actuals. The expenditure 2 is basically the original budget, the encumbrances, and the actuals. So it's a percent expenditures with just actuals, and a percent expenditures with actual and encumbrances. So lots of information there to digest. I think sometimes a visual of what's possible makes the functionality come into light. If you have any questions about how to do this or assistance with setting up your custom columns, I'd be more than happy to answer those questions for you. My email address is Kathy with a K, .Dwyer, D-W-Y-E-R, @Zobrio.com. And if you have any questions, please feel free to send me an email and we can talk about that and in general how the custom columns can improve your reporting. So that's all I've got for today. And I'll back to you, Colleen, if you have anything you'd like to talk about.
I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us and tell everyone that a recording of this webinar will be made available shortly. Thank you.
Okay, thanks all. Appreciate your time. Bye-bye.